This story feels like a biography of my life. The D-Day, or the day I discovered some shocking truth, was about a year and a half ago. While many of you might say that having daughters is the best thing in the world, it wasn't the case for me. My first daughter was quite a handful, to the point where she pushed me to the brink. She was like the first falling domino that brought my whole family down. And don't even get me started on my wife. I dreaded the day when my first daughter was born. However, my second daughter is an angel, a complete opposite of her sister. Let me give you some background about me. I'm 45 years old and my wife is 42. I'm just an average guy living up in the Midwest, working for a delivery service. My wife, on the other hand, owns a local business. I earn enough to avoid living paycheck to paycheck, but I wouldn't call it comfortable, making around $85K a year. My wife, depending on the number of clients she gets, brings in about $55K, $70K, but she doesn't contribute to the bills, only groceries. Most major expenses fall on my shoulders. She has her own business, event cleaning and catering service. So she caters for events and then cleans up the facility afterward. She employs a couple of people, and she often gets contracts for office building cleaning as well. Our house is fully paid for, so technically, we should be living comfortably. But if not for my wife's shopping habits and my youngest daughter's boarding school fees, we would probably be more at ease. I have a 21-year-old and a 19-year-old. My 21-year-old daughter is the one who has caused me so much distress. Even back in middle school, my wife and I had to keep a close eye on her because trouble always seemed to find her. She was frequently getting in trouble at school. When she was just 13, we received a call from the principal because she had been in a fight at school. She had hurt another girl, and I had to shell out $5,000 out of my own pocket to cover her and the other girl's medical expenses, mainly because she had initiated the fight. The reason she got into a fight with the girl was because she claimed the girl stole her boyfriend. I didn't even realize that 13-year-olds could have boyfriends. I was the youngest of 5 brothers and was primarily raised by my dad and brothers. My mom passed away during childbirth, so I've always had a more traditional, blue-collar, and hard-working approach to life. Going to college was an option, but in our area, most people worked for a big company called Caterpillar. My dad dedicated 55 years to that company, and all my brothers worked there too. However, things changed during the Clinton administration when trade deals sent our jobs to China, and many companies moved to other regions or overseas to avoid unions. I was part of the union, and at 25 years old, I was making a good living, nearly $100,000 a year. I got married and even paid for a house with cash. Unfortunately, I was laid off, and while I found another job in the delivery business, it didn't pay as well as the union job. In hindsight, I should have taken the opportunity to attend college and earn a degree, which might have allowed me to move to another part of the country. Most jobs in this area have disappeared, and it's becoming something of a welfare state with less desirable neighbors moving in. I waited too long, and I felt like I missed my chance. Moreover, I didn't have any role models who had gone to college because I didn't know anyone in that situation. I essentially married the first girl I felt close to, but in hindsight, it wasn't a wise choice, as my wife had previous partners before me. Moreover, I didn't thoroughly investigate her background and history. If I had, I might have recognized the source of my daughter's wild behavior earlier, as they say. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Additionally, it's worth noting that I had very little experience with women. My wife is the only woman I've ever been with, and she, along with my daughters, are the only women I've been close to. I remember when my eldest daughter was 14, her mother and I were called to the school by the principal to pick her up. She had gotten into trouble again. I worked 12-hour shifts, 5 days a week, so I couldn't leave work until 4 p.m., and then it took me until 4:30 p.m. to reach the school, making me late. My wife was already there. Our daughter had been detained by the school police for being caught smoking with some boys at school. We discovered she had been sneaking around, associating with kids who sold it at her school. My response was to ground her, take her cell phone away for a month, and stop her allowance for 3 months. However, this didn't resolve the issue because the school contacted us again, this time for the 3rd time. This time, my mind was blown away. I was devastated and embarrassed by what she did. The principal didn't even know how to explain it to me. She was so embarrassed herself, my daughter was caught giving BJ to multiple male students in the bathroom for money. I really didn't know what to do at that point. I really lost it. I totally went blank at the principal's office. After I heard the principal say that she gave BJ to other boys, I went Norm. I didn't hear the rest of what she said. I couldn't even bring myself to look at my daughter. In my eyes, her innocence was forever lost. Who knows what else she might have done? The repugnant image of her actions plagued my thoughts. I grew up in an environment dominated by males, and my instinctive reaction was to discipline her harshly. I might have gone too far. I didn't punch her, but I did slap her repeatedly out of frustration once we got home. Her mother intervened to shield her, resulting in a heated argument that concluded with both of them leaving to stay with a relative for 2 days. Looking back, I now understand that I should have handled things differently. Still, I shouldn't be too harsh on myself because I believe that any father might have reacted similarly. I conducted a self-examination to see if I'd played a role in my daughter's troublesome behavior. We raised her with love and affection, and I looked back on my own behavior while growing up. I was not rebellious, never got into trouble, didn't drink, use pills, or engage in misconduct. I was always willing to help around the house even without being asked. I was fortunate to grow up in a loving and happy home with my single father and brothers. However, I failed to thoroughly investigate my wife's background to comprehend where my daughter might have inherited this wayward behavior. In the end, I allowed my daughter and wife back into the house. We established some ground rules at that point. But unfortunately, it was too late as news of the incident had already spread. Other students became aware of what had happened. Apparently, she had engaged in such activities with 9 boys in the bathroom. The word got around through kids' conversations, and some even captured parts of it on camera, which then circulated throughout the school. The story reached some parents as well. The school authorities wanted to prevent this story from becoming headline news because it would be a major embarrassment for them. As a result, she wasn't suspended or faced any official consequences to avoid further publicity. The school did make efforts to suppress and suspend any students who shared the video, and they were somewhat successful in their attempts. It was an incredibly tough situation for me. As a result of the incident, I became known as the dad of the girl involved in inappropriate activities in bathroom stalls. You can imagine how embarrassing and frustrating that was for me, the quiet and friendly neighbor, the hardworking delivery guy, who suddenly had a daughter linked to such actions. It's important to note that my youngest daughter witnessed all of this during that time. My wife and I were convinced that we couldn't afford to let our youngest daughter be influenced by her older sister or the environment. You see, teenage girls are very impressionable, especially when it comes to their older siblings. So, during that period, I believed that I needed to earn more money in order to send my youngest daughter away. I put in extra hours at work to bridge the gap, with the goal of sending her to a Catholic boarding school in another state. Looking back, it was the best investment I've ever made in my life. Sending my oldest daughter along, however, wasn't financially feasible. I believed that my oldest daughter was beyond redemption at the time, and we simply didn't have the funds to send her to the same school. Who could blame me at the time? In my rigid mindset, I thought you couldn't get any worse than giving BJ to 9 classmates at 15. What could be worse than that? So, I thought. But little did I know that she was just getting started. When I was growing up, I was always mindful of the consequences of my actions. Before I did anything, I would carefully consider its impact, how it would affect others, and what others would feel about it. This thoughtful approach was an inherent part of my upbringing. It wasn't something I was taught, it was simply who I am, a part of my nature. On the other hand, my wife tends to be more spontaneous. She often speaks without thinking, reacts impulsively, and later regrets her actions, much like my daughter. As a result, her impulsive behavior has strained relationships and led to many conflicts. It has also put me in the position of being a peacemaker. I can recall several instances where we ended up in arguments that we really had no business getting into. She's the reason why I stopped going to baseball games with her, or attending family outings with a large group of people. I distinctly remember one incident at a baseball game where she attempted to cut in line ahead of another couple. I had to remind her that we should follow the same rules as everyone else, and that we weren't special. In short, my wife didn't heed my advice. She attempted to bypass a couple, and things escalated into a shoving match when the husband of the woman pushed her. I had to step in to defend my wife's honor, even though I had warned her about it. We ended up in a public brawl, which was highly unusual for me. To put it briefly, it turned into a chaotic scuffle, with punches thrown and bottles broken. The police had to intervene, but fortunately, I avoided arrest because I was acquainted with many of the officers in that town. I had volunteered for the fire department, and some of them were my former schoolmates. This incident occurred when I was in my 30s, but similar events had happened from time to time. Keep in mind that my daughters witnessed all of this. The strange part is that she only behaves this way when I'm with her. I believe she wouldn't have engaged in a fight with that couple if she knew I wasn't present. But every time she knows I'm there, she seems to find a way to embarrass me or put me in a situation where I might get into trouble. Consequently, I try to limit our participation in public events to avoid potential embarrassment. All of this didn't happen suddenly. She has always been like this, but I thought she would change. Back when I knew her in her late teens and early 20s, she would engage in such behavior, and I found it exciting because I hadn't experienced someone that wild before. We would do daring things in public and engage in all sorts of mischief. It was thrilling initially, but it grew tiresome quickly, especially as I was becoming a father and we were building a family. I tried to do the right thing, thinking it was a phase she would outgrow, but these patterns have continued to this day. Additionally, I've had several instances where she accused me of checking out other women and thinking about cheating just because I happened to glance in the direction of a cute girl. This often led to heated arguments between us. I work a 12-hour day, and I barely have time to cheat even if I wanted to. But she keeps accusing me of infidelity. Later, I discovered she accused me of cheating to divert my attention from her. There's a saying that when you point a finger at someone, 3 fingers are pointing back at you. And let me tell you about her compulsive shopping habit. Everyone has their vices, like overeating or using substances. Hers is shopping. She constantly seeks validation, even at her age. She's quite superficial, going to great lengths to avoid gaining weight and compulsively buying new outfits to boost her self-esteem. Having a brand new outfit is an obsession for her, so she shops nearly every day. Strangely, she doesn't contribute her earnings to our bills, and I don't even see her paycheck until the end of the year. If she shared the financial burden, we could afford to send both our daughters to a boarding school and lead a more comfortable life. After my daughter's fiasco, I should have been more vigilant, but kids at school teased her so much that she started skipping classes. She would pretend to go to school, but instead hung out with the wrong crowd, smoking MJ. I assumed everything was fine. Since my wife wasn't contributing, I was working longer hours, and I had to pay for my second daughter's private boarding school by myself. I expected my wife to ensure our oldest daughter went to school and maintained good attendance. About a year later, 2 things happened. I never received any news from her school, and my daughter and her mom became incredibly close, almost like best friends. Initially, I found their relationship unhealthy, but as I hadn't heard any serious complaints from my oldest daughter's school, I assumed my wife had things under control, and my daughter was heading in the right direction. My wife hadn't voiced any concerns, so I thought all was well. When my daughter was 17, I came home early one afternoon feeling unwell. I noticed a tall, skinny young guy standing on my lawn, probably in his early 20s at the time. He claimed to be a friend of my daughter, dropping her off to pick up something and waiting for her return to give her a ride. I assured him she'd be fine, and I'd take her myself. My wife's work Econoline van was in the driveway, so she was home. I had a bad feeling about the situation. As the guy drove away, I took note of his license plate and other details, just in case something went wrong in my house, like a robbery, or if he was involved in some nefarious activity while my wife was in the house. After he left, I hurried back into the house. As I rushed in, my daughter was rushing out, appearing in a hurry. I asked her who the guy was, and she said he was her friend. I mentioned that he didn't look like a high schooler, and she said he had already graduated. I inquired why she was hanging out with someone not from her school, and I followed that with asking why she wasn't in school by now, pointing out that her class should be in session. She claimed her class was canceled, but I had a feeling she was lying. I had thought she had improved in the 2 years since I last heard from her school, but seeing this behavior made me realize it had gotten worse, and I had been kept in the dark. I was beginning to think that she wasn't just skipping school and lying about it, but also hanging out with a guy who looked like a dealer. It was the proof I needed that my daughter was now off the rails. My wife's van was in the driveway, so I thought she might have some answers. Given their close relationship, I thought maybe she could explain these shenanigans. I entered the house, but my wife wasn't there. I called her name and heard some noises coming from the basement. I went down to the basement and my wife was heading out. The first thing I noticed was the smell of MJ on her breath, and it was emanating from the basement. I asked her why I was home, and I explained that I was feeling sick. I asked if she knew that our daughter had been dropped off by a strange guy and was lying about her canceled class. I thought it might come as a shock to her if she didn't know about the man, but she was surprisingly dismissive. She claimed the guy was our daughter's friend and that they had come to pick up something. I couldn't believe it. I told her I never wanted to see that man again and to instruct our daughter not to hang out with him anymore. Feeling unwell, I cut the argument short, though I still had many questions. I told my daughter that her mom would drop her off at school and then went to bed to rest. Update. That day, I fell asleep and woke up in the middle of the night, still troubled by the earlier incident. It was the foremost thing on my mind. Upon waking up feeling a bit better and thinking more clearly, everything seemed to click into place. I saw a guy who looked like he might deal in MJ on my front lawn, and there was the unmistakable smell of MJ in the basement where my wife had spent a lot of time. She must have noticed it too. Additionally, I couldn't ignore how close my daughter and her mom had become. From this deductive reasoning, I concluded that my wife might be involved in this. Perhaps she was smoking with my daughter, and that guy might be their supplier. Even though my wife isn't a smoker, she always tries to fit in with the younger crowd and act like the cool mom. She's quite immature, and I wouldn't put it past her to engage in this kind of behavior. Like many things she does, she seems to disregard the consequences of her actions. At this point, suspecting that my wife might be smoking with my daughter or at least covering up for her, I completely lost faith in her ability to be a role model for my daughter. So, I decided to schedule an appointment with the school principal to inquire about my daughter's attendance and performance without my wife's knowledge. That morning, before heading to work, I called the principal's office and arranged a meeting for noon. During the meeting, I discovered that my daughter rarely attended class, and they had been sending mail to my home about her attendance. She hadn't completed her core courses, which meant she wasn't on track to graduate on time because her grades were so poor. As you can imagine, my suspicions were confirmed. Now I was concerned about how my daughter was spending all her free time since she wasn't going to classes. I thought my daughter was reverting to her old habits. Maybe she's hanging out with boys like the one I saw on my lawn. The most pressing question now is how much her mom knew about this. If she knew and was covering for her, I might have no choice but to file for divorce because that would show a lack of control and sabotage to my efforts. Reflecting on the past, I feel partially responsible for all this. When companies were leaving the area and moving down south or to places like Mexico and China, home prices dropped significantly. Many of my friends left the state, relocating to places like Florida, Texas, Arizona, and more. However, I chose to stay. I should have sold my house and left too. Instead, I stayed, and the value of my house declined by nearly 50%. The neighborhood isn't the same, and the quality of the schools has deteriorated over time. This region is experiencing a decline, and I feel like I fell victim to the boiling frog syndrome, too complacent to realize that I needed to move to a better area. I don't know if my daughter would have turned out differently, but I'm certain it would have been harder for her to find bad influences in a better school district. That evening, when I got home, I confronted my wife about our daughter's school attendance. She claimed she had no idea that our daughter had been skipping school. She said she hadn't heard from the school, and the school stopped sending letters, so she assumed everything was going well. I told her that I had noticed the smell of MJ when she was coming out of the basement yesterday. She insisted it was our daughter and said she had caught her smoking and drinking at one point. Our daughter promised to stop drinking. My wife mentioned that while she didn't like our daughter smoking, she didn't want to push her away, fearing that strictness would make her run away with some boys, and she didn't want to lose her. My wife is definitely more open-minded than I am, because I don't believe she grasps that using MJ is a bad thing. I informed her that I would take action. I wasn't going to idly watch her squander her future under my roof, especially considering the many enthusiasts in our town, and I certainly don't want her to become one of them. I reached out to my friend at the sheriff's department and asked for his help in talking sense into my daughter. The following day, I took a day off from work and brought my daughter to the police station. My intention was for the sheriff to show her the potential consequences of her life if she doesn't change. It was meant to be a sort of scared straight scenario where he would introduce her to women in prison for various crimes. After the meeting with the sheriff, I expressed my gratitude, and he also inquired about the man who was selling it to her. I provided the man's name and his license plate, and the sheriff promised to take care of it. I thanked him, and we left. Little did I know, while we were meeting with the sheriff, my 17-year-old daughter had already been 2 months pregnant. My wife told me about it on the same day she found out. She explained that she had just discovered this because our daughter was displaying symptoms. My initial reaction was to suggest that she get an abortion, and I placed the blame on my wife, accusing her of acting more like a friend than a mother. I considered this situation a substantial embarrassment and wanted to resolve it as quickly as possible. However, my wife disagreed and wanted to keep the baby. In my household, it's not a democracy. My word is final. I refused to accept the idea that my daughter's life would resemble those I've seen on TV. I couldn't persuade my wife to my viewpoint, and my relationship with my daughter was strained. I expressed my disappointment and how she had ruined her life, raising my voice and using hurtful names. I thought she had listened, that she understood the seriousness of the situation. Unfortunately, she didn't, because the next day she had disappeared, taking most of her belongings with her, and she had run away from home. My wife pointed the finger at me for my heavy-handed approach. We were both under a lot of stress. I went to work and explained the whole situation to my supervisor to request some time off so I could search for my daughter. Fortunately, he was very understanding and granted me 2 weeks of unpaid leave. Over the course of 2 days, we scoured the area searching for my daughter in the MJ cellar because, at that time, I assumed he was responsible for the pregnancy. Yet he was nowhere to be found, even at his known addresses. I even reached out to some of his family members and relatives in the area, and word had it that he might have recently fled to another state due to having outstanding warrants. On the 3rd day, my daughter reached out to my wife and let her know she was doing fine. She mentioned that she didn't want to talk to me because she was aware of how angry I was with her, and she suggested we stop searching for her. This was incredibly hard for me to accept. It felt like I had lost my daughter, and continuing to try to change her seemed futile. I decided it was best to focus on my work and put all my hopes on my other daughter because she showed great promise. She excelled in school, had a similar disposition to mine, and ticked all the right boxes. Yet not a day went by without me thinking about my estranged daughter. Fast forward 5 months and she had a baby girl. My wife and my younger daughter went to visit her in another state, but I couldn't bring myself to go. Upon their return, they described the dire living conditions my daughter and her current boyfriend were enduring. This guy wasn't just a loser, he was even failing as a seller. She sure knows how to pick them. 3 months before my daughter gave birth, she attempted to make amends with me, realizing that life as a runaway bride with a failing seller wasn't as ideal as she'd thought. However, I simply ignored her. My wife returned from the visit with a letter from my daughter, and as I read it, she was apologizing. She had come to realize that what I had been telling her was the truth. In her letter, she expressed regret for not having me in her life due to her actions. She acknowledged that she tried her best to make me proud, but kept getting into trouble. I later discovered that her boyfriend had been in and out of jail for pills-related charges, and he struggled to maintain a stable job or make a living. My wife had been sending them money to support their nomadic lifestyle, drifting from one motel to another with their newborn. During that Christmas, my daughter returned home with the baby for a visit, and we managed to reconcile. I accepted the baby. However, when she expressed the desire to stay home with the baby after Christmas, I was firm in not allowing it. At 19, she was legally an adult, and I wanted her to lead a separate life from mine. I found peace in the knowledge that she was no longer my responsibility. Additionally, I had no desire for that scumbag boyfriend to hang around my house. Regardless of grandkids, she was welcome to visit during the holidays, but I wouldn't support her financially. My wife had a different perspective on this matter. She wanted our daughter to stay home with us, cherished the child, and tried hard to persuade me. We had a major disagreement over this, and my wife gave me the silent treatment and refused intimacy for months. But I remained resolute. I wanted my daughter gone. She was no longer my problem. I urged her to move back to where she came from and stay there. But surprisingly, she and her low-life boyfriend moved back to town. In February, as I predicted, he got arrested for some outstanding warrant and was sentenced to 7 months in prison. During his time in prison, my daughter and her baby began to visit my house frequently. It almost went unnoticed when they moved in. I also started to develop a fondness for the baby, as her presence seemed to bring joy to my wife and my daughter, and livened up the household. My daughter began working for my wife, along with her 2 other employees, and they were doing well. Everything seemed to be going smoothly. Fast forward about 5 months, I learned that he was released from prison early. I had a conversation with my daughter, making it clear that she could move out and stay with him because I didn't want to see him around my house. I was very explicit, hoping that both my wife and my daughter understood my stance. Well, for a while I didn't see him around, at least not when I wasn't at work. Then one evening, as we were about to go to bed, my wife informed me that he had contacted her, asking if she could hire him. My wife had 3 employees at the time, including my daughter, and her business was growing. She believed we needed an extra hand. She mentioned that due to his criminal record, he couldn't find a job elsewhere, and his probation officer required him to secure employment. She also mentioned that he was off pills, as they regularly conducted pills tests on him, and he was trying to turn his life around. I responded to my wife, acknowledging his efforts to change his life but insisting that he do it somewhere else, away from my family. He had already caused enough damage to my daughter, and I didn't want him to inflict any more harm. That's where we left that conversation. About a week later, on my way back from work, I pulled into my driveway, and to my surprise, I saw him there. He was assisting my wife and daughter in unloading items from their Econoline van, which she used for work. He was helping them move things to the backyard shed and the basement. It turned out that my wife had been employing him as a helping hand for some time without my knowledge. I confronted him and demanded that he leave my property. My wife and daughter didn't utter a word, knowing how upset I was. That day, I almost considered kicking my daughter out of the house. She explained it wasn't her fault as she had told him to stay away. Instead, it was her mom who allowed him to help. Needless to say, the house wasn't very peaceful that night. During that evening, I threatened to kick my daughter out of the house if I ever saw him around my home again. My wife believed I was overreacting. I suggested to my daughter that she was making money now and could afford her own place. I even asked why she didn't move out with him. She responded that she was saving money and didn't want to live with him until he had a stable job. She mentioned that if my wife didn't hire him, he might resort to using pills again and could end up in prison, facing severe consequences. Although I didn't say it aloud, I secretly thought that this might be a solution to get him out of the picture. I had a hunch that this guy might never turn his life around and would continue clinging to my family, so prison seemed like a fitting place for him. After that day, I didn't see him again for about 2 to 3 months. However, I started noticing the smell of MJ around my house, especially in the basement. I didn't want to confront my wife or daughter about it, fearing they might lie or hide it from me. Instead, I decided to take action and purchased a motion-activated security camera, cleverly disguised as a wall clock, which I placed in the basement. This camera had 128 GB of storage and could record up to 96 hours of footage. It sent alerts to my phone and was connected to my Wi-Fi, but with my busy work schedule, I didn't have the time to constantly monitor my phone. So I bought 2 of these cameras, allowing me to record 2 weeks' worth of motion-activated footage. My plan was to review the recordings in one go. After 2 weeks of recording, on a Saturday, I sat down in my home office and began to review the footage. The first day showed regular household activities, with my wife and daughter frequenting the basement where they stored equipment and items, and my wife had her private office. However, nothing seemed unusual at this point. On the second day my wife was captured on camera, then the camera captioned my daughter's boyfriend as he walked behind my wife and started kissing her neck. He fondled her from behind. Then my wife dropped to her knees and started giving him a BJ. I was in disbelief at what I was seeing. I rubbed my eyes, hoping it wasn't my daughter in the video. Despite my wishes, it was clearly my wife that I was watching, and I was stunned. The video continued to record as a man began being intimate with my wife. They were together for about 20 minutes before leaving, and their actions were similar to scenes from adult films. They seemed so casual, indicating that this might have been happening for a while. I was so upset that I quickly skimmed through that video to find more proof of their meetings. On another day, they entered the room being affectionate. He was very intimate with my wife in ways I hadn't been, and they seemed so sure they wouldn't get caught that they even took time to relax and smoke it afterward before dressing and leaving. There were 2 more days like that, so they were involved in these activities at least 3 days a week. During this period, we were probably being intimate just once a week, so he was spending more time with my wife than I was. I was completely bewildered because I didn't see this coming. I suspected my wife of smoking MJ with my daughter, but I never thought she'd take things further with her boyfriend, especially someone I strongly disliked. I couldn't fathom why she would betray me this way, considering she knew it would devastate me and our family. It just didn't make any sense. I had no inkling that my wife was into smoking, and I wanted to know when this involvement with him started. If she could cheat on me with him, who knows what else she could be up to with other partners. At this point, I felt like my entire marriage and life had been a sham. All the hard work I'd put into our family seemed utterly wasted, without any reward. I also noticed that the times they were intimate coincided with when my daughter and her other employees were at work, suggesting that she was planning private time with him. At that moment, I was filled with rage towards this guy. My first step was to call my daughter, who was downstairs at the time. I played the tape for her, and she witnessed everything, just as surprised as I was. She disclosed that her mom had started taking her MJ when she was in high school and would give her money to purchase it. She explained that her excessive use had brought her close to the boyfriend, and that's how they began dating. However, my daughter explained that she never suspected an affair between them, but knew they were close and spoke on the phone. They hid it from me because she thought her mom was trying to protect her. Thankfully, my daughter provided me with the probation officer's contact, and I sent him the recording of the boyfriend smoking, hoping for a pills test. My daughter filled in some of the missing details I had questions about, like how my wife concealed her attendance issues from me when they became best friends and when my wife started smoking. However, she had no inkling of the affair and never suspected anything. My wife was skilled at covering her tracks while acting as if my daughter was the sole issue. She ruined her own daughter's life, and for what? So she could get high and be with this guy. Enraged and wanting this guy gone for good, I spoke to my law enforcement friend. He even drove by my house unasked, wanting to be there when I confronted my wife. I tried to get him to leave as it was a private matter, but he insisted because he saw how angry I was and didn't want me to do something I'd regret. My wife didn't attempt to deny the accusations, probably because everything was on tape. She refused to disclose when it all started, fearing I'd use that against her. That day I threw her things out of the house. To say I was devastated is an understatement. My daughter was devastated too. My wife had orchestrated this entire situation from the beginning, pretending to help me while sabotaging my family. What a terrible situation. Update. My wife's infidelity caught me completely off guard. In my eyes, she was even worse than my daughter. That day, I threw some of her things out, but my sheriff friend who was there discouraged me from going any further. I was overwhelmed with rage that day, and I didn't need any explanation from my wife. To me, she was the enemy, and her betrayal needed no further explanation. The following day, my rage transformed into restlessness and a desire for revenge. Restlessness because I now wanted to know when all of this began. Revenge because I wanted to make my daughter's boyfriend pay for destroying my family. After submitting the video of him smoking to the probation officer, my sheriff friend, who was aware of the video, assured me he would press the probation officer to expedite action against him. In terms of smoking, my wife hadn't done anything illegal since it's legal in my state to smoke in your own home. However, for my daughter's boyfriend, he was on probation for using and distributing pills. Part of his probation required participation in a pills offense program or treatment, which he obviously violated. It's been 3 days since I kicked my wife out of the house, and she's been trying to contact me by phone, but I've blocked her. She was in touch with my oldest daughter, who was still at my house, and used her to send messages to me. Initially, my daughter was upset because of my wife's betrayal, but I later discovered that she became indifferent to the situation. I thought maybe it was because my wife was her sole source of income, and she relied on my wife for everything. I wouldn't want my daughter to forgive her mom solely because she had no choice. I wanted her to feel free to speak her mind without fear, so I could get to the bottom of this. I was willing to support my daughter until she could find another means of income. My wife is a terrible person who manipulated my daughter into buying it for her, and then acted as if my daughter was the issue. I wanted to free my daughter from her influence, and despite the challenges she faces as a young mother, she could still have a successful life away from her mother and other negative influences. That evening, after work, I talked to my daughter to get more details. She explained that it all began when she was caught smoking at the age of 14. Although she pretended to have quit to deceive both me and my wife, she continued to use. Then one day, her mom found some MJ in her room while cleaning. My daughter begged my wife not to tell me, and she didn't. However, her mom kept it and never got rid of it. My daughter suspected her mom had been sneaking into her room to search for it because her things were occasionally moved. After being caught performing an act at school, my daughter's mom was concerned and wanted to prevent it from happening again. Unlike my approach, her mom was more open and non-judgmental. My daughter confessed that she was angry with her parents and did the act to get money for MJ. Her mom believed the best solution was to give my daughter money to buy it instead of her performing such acts. I was unaware of this. One day, my daughter's mom caught her smoking in the backyard and decided to join her. They smoked 2 blunts that day, and from then on, my wife became addicted to it. They would smoke when I wasn't home and carefully hide any evidence. It was around that time they grew very close, and my daughter mentioned she was getting it for free from her current boyfriend. He made sure she always had plenty of these things. He was trying to pursue a romantic relationship with her, but she was using him for pills and wasn't interested in a serious relationship at the time. He provided her with more and more to impress her. Ironically, my wife was using most of the MJ he supplied. Initially, she didn't have any romantic interest in him and led him on because she was using him for her own benefit. She was taking money from her mom and getting free from him. Everything changed when her current boyfriend dropped off some at our house and her mom saw him. My wife introduced herself to him, much to my daughter's surprise. At the time, she was around 16 years old, while he was about 6 years older than my daughter. Continuing, my daughter explained that my wife invited him into the basement, and among other things, they spent time smoking. She soon left the basement, leaving him and my wife together. They got along well, laughing and making jokes. My daughter felt left out of the conversation, and she had plans to meet up with friends, so she left the house for about 3 hours. When she returned home, he and my wife were still in the basement, but as soon as she came back, he decided to leave. Not long after that, he began finding excuses to visit our house, and one time I even caught him on our lawn. Afterward, my daughter and he became a couple and started dating, and she soon became pregnant. Initially, she wanted to have an abortion, especially after I persuaded her to do so. However, my wife convinced her otherwise. Additionally, her boyfriend threatened her life if she tried to terminate the pregnancy. She realized there was no way to stay in the house with the baby without significant conflict. So, my wife and her boyfriend arranged for my daughter to move to another state until the child was born. They planned for her to run away. Throughout the entire time when she was reported missing, my wife remained in contact with her and her boyfriend. They spoke on the phone with my wife, and all the while she acted like she had no idea where they were, deceiving me. While my daughter explained all of this to me, I couldn't help but wonder why my wife was undermining my efforts to help my daughter change for the better. At that time, I didn't suspect any of it. Given what I now know, I think my wife encouraged her and gave her permission to behave recklessly. In a way, I see my daughter as a victim in all of this. My only regret is that she never confided in me, but I now understand why she didn't. She went on to explain that during her pregnancy, her mom secretly visited her multiple times without my knowledge and provided them with money. This was because her boyfriend was frequently getting into trouble with the police, and he was unfamiliar with the area they were in. Their original plan was to stay in the other state for a longer period, but they had to change their plan because her boyfriend couldn't stop getting into trouble and ending up in and out of jail. After the first Christmas she attended at our home, my wife asked her to stay closer to us so she could see her grandson more often. Gradually, she moved back into my house. Once my daughter explained all of this to me, everything started to make sense. It was clear that my wife was playing both sides, which explained why I couldn't make progress with my daughter. All along, my wife's influence was behind my daughter's problems, driven by her selfish desires. My daughter explained that her relationship with her ex-boyfriend was largely due to her mom's pressure and manipulation. She admitted that she wasn't in love with him, but cared about him. What she didn't know was that all along, he had been having an affair with my wife, and she no longer had any interest in him. As I mentioned before, my wife and daughter are still in contact, and my daughter continues to work for her mom. In the following week, I had a meeting with my wife to come to some kind of arrangement because most of her belongings were still in my house. I wasn't as angry as I had been a week ago, especially after hearing that my daughter's now ex-boyfriend was in county jail and unable to make bail. His bail was set high because he was considered a flight risk, mostly due to the efforts it took to capture him, and he was facing a lengthy sentence. My law enforcement friends informed me that he had been summoned for a pill test after the video of him smoking was turned in to his parole officer. As soon as he got wind of this, he tried to flee, but was later apprehended and sent to county jail. I made amends with my daughter because I felt that my wife was largely responsible for most of her misconduct. However, I continued to watch her closely. During the meeting with my daughter was at home, and my wife apologized for betraying us. She asked for my forgiveness and begged me not to divorce her. She attributed the affair to her obsession with using pills. She claimed that her business was struggling and she needed distractions, which led her to start smoking and eventually have the affair. I found her reasons to be illogical, and I didn't fully trust her. But considering the long time we've spent together and the fact that my daughter, whom I believe she wronged, was willing to forgive her, I thought, why shouldn't I? Additionally, her business was booming and she was running it from our home. Finding another place for her business would be costly, so I decided to give our relationship a second chance, but with some conditions. Before she moved back into the house, I made it clear that one more lie would mean the end of our relationship. I had even been contemplating selling the house and moving out of the neighborhood. A week later, everything seemed to be going well. My wife appeared to be making amends for her past actions. She was transparent about her whereabouts and assured me that she hadn't been in contact with my daughter's ex-boyfriend who was in jail. My wife and my daughter were working on repairing their relationship, and things were on the upswing. Their business was thriving too. A few days later, I noticed a strange car following me when I went from my house to a nearby store. At first, I didn't think much of it. However, upon my return from the store, I noticed the same car again. I kept an eye on the driver to signal that I was aware of the situation. When I reached home, I looked out of my window once more and saw the same car pass by my house. I took note of the license plate and the driver. The next morning, I found all 4 of my car tires punctured and the body of my car scratched. I reported the car's destruction to the police and provided information about the suspicious car that had been passing by my house. Not surprisingly, the car turned out to be stolen, leading me to suspect that the driver might be connected to my daughter's ex-boyfriend, either as a friend or a family member. I decided to inquire with my boss at work about any job openings in the southern states so that I could transfer. He mentioned that there were openings in Texas and Alabama with details yet to be finalized, but it would be a lateral move, not a promotion. At that point, I was ready to leave this area, despite how much I had grown to like it. I had invested a great deal in the community, having served as a volunteer firefighter and established close relationships with law enforcement. However, the ongoing changes and the vandalism I experienced were the last straws for me. I felt that the community had moved away from what it once was. Around 2 weeks after the property damage incident, my daughter informed me that her ex-boyfriend had been attempting to contact her. She explained that he first called her from prison, and because she didn't recognize the number, she answered. He informed her that he had accepted a plea deal, and his case wouldn't go to trial. His charges included multiple offenses related to pills with intent to sell, theft, probation violation, resisting arrest, and transporting restricted substances across state lines, which was a federal charge. He was potentially facing a substantial prison sentence. My daughter revealed that her ex-boyfriend had shifted the blame onto me and was resentful towards me. It astounded me that this man had the audacity to enter my house, harm my family, and then point fingers at me for his problems. It showcased his arrogance and recklessness, believing he could do as he pleased without consequences. I was relieved he was behind bars, and I hoped he would face a full trial to be held accountable for all his crimes. My only concern is that my new grandson doesn't inherit his father's traits. As harsh as it may sound, when I look at my grandson's face, I'm reminded of his father. To me, it feels like a glaring challenge, as if my grandson is defying me in his infant form. I anticipate that I'll be the one raising this child, responsible for ensuring he doesn't follow in the footsteps of his parents. Even though my wife has been behaving well and trying to make amends, I can't trust her anymore. I still think I should have divorced her because I can't trust her with my daughter, and especially not with my new grandson. As part of our reconciliation agreement, I've purchased a $5 pill test cup online, and I use it to screen my wife and daughter every week. So far, things have been going fine. Fast forward about a month later, my daughter had blocked calls from any unfamiliar numbers, so communication attempts from her ex-boyfriend's family and friends were unsuccessful. She had severed ties with her underground associates and was heeding my guidance. Our relationship had improved, and she was maturing into the person I had hoped she would become. She was also working towards obtaining her GED so that she could re-enroll in college. I reached out to my law enforcement friends to inquire about my daughter's ex-boyfriend's sentencing and learned that he had received a mandatory 15-year prison term. At that moment, I felt relieved and hoped that these 15 years behind bars might help him become a better person, although I wasn't very optimistic about it. When I was about to end the call with my law enforcement friend, he invited me to a bar and mentioned that an officer from the cell block where my daughter's ex-boyfriend was serving his sentence would be there. Initially, I declined, stating that I wanted nothing to do with my daughter's ex-boyfriend, as he was no longer my concern. However, I later changed my mind, recognizing the value of having friends in law enforcement. I've made a habit of establishing connections with people in law enforcement and positions of authority throughout my career, and it often proves useful. On a Saturday night, I met the officer who worked in the cell block where my daughter's ex-boyfriend was incarcerated. He appeared to be a pleasant person, and we struck up a good conversation. I mentioned that my daughter's boyfriend was doing time there, and while he didn't recognize him by name, he took note of it. Fast forward 2 weeks, and I encountered the officer again at a law enforcement event. Given my role as a volunteer for the local firefighters, I regularly attended such events around town. During our conversation, the officer disclosed that a woman had come for a conjugal visit with my daughter's ex-boyfriend. At first, he thought it might be my daughter, considering they had a child together. However, the woman seemed a bit too old to be my daughter. I asked him if he could provide a description, and he informed me that he only knew she was a white woman in her late to mid-40s. He jotted down her name from the check-in list, but admitted he hadn't gotten a good look because he only noticed them holding hands after the visit, after which she promptly left. He was quite busy with his job, but managed to sneak a peek at the check-in list and jotted down a name, although he wasn't entirely sure it was the correct one. He took my number and promised to share the name the next day when he returned to work, as he'd written it down on a piece of paper in his work locker. When I returned home that day, you can imagine the worry that consumed me. I knew it couldn't be my daughter, and I hoped and prayed it wasn't my wife, as that would truly haunt me. That night, I couldn't even sleep. I eagerly awaited a text from the officer at 9 a.m. the next morning to reveal the name. And wouldn't you know it, at 8:30 a.m., he messaged me with the name, my wife's name. I couldn't believe it. I was already at work by then, and I knew my wife and daughter were at their jobs because they started earlier than me. I couldn't fathom that our efforts to reconcile were all part of a grand deception. My wife hadn't changed. She must be utterly obsessed with him to go to the extent of visiting him in jail. Despite all the tears and pleas, it had all been a lie. My first action was to contact a divorce lawyer in my area and arrange a visit for that day. I also got in touch with a real estate agent to schedule a walkthrough of my house for putting it on the market. I checked with my boss to inquire about the progress of the transfer and was told we'd receive a response in 2 weeks. He also mentioned more details about the position in Texas, located in Dallas, and the possibility of a pay increase, though it wasn't confirmed. Additionally, I called my daughter, who was at work, and asked her to return home early. However, she explained that she couldn't because of work commitments that would affect her coworkers. I left work early so I could make it to the lawyer's office. Most of the necessary information had been collected over the phone, so the visit to her office mainly involved discussing details and picking up the divorce documents to serve my wife. When I was already back home, my wife and daughter returned. I had the divorce papers ready. Once they were seated, I addressed my daughter, revealing that her mom had been having conjugal visits with her ex-boyfriend in state prison and had been lying to us all along. My wife didn't attempt to deny it. She began crying, apologizing, and confessing it was only once. I called her a tramp and branded her an unbelievably evil person. I served her the divorce papers and informed her she needed to prepare to move out because I was selling the house and relocating to Texas. My daughter immediately asked if she could come with me, and I agreed. I wasn't as angry as I had anticipated. Instead, I felt a sense of relief now that the truth was out. I could finally break free from this wicked woman and this place, and I was looking forward to the future, especially because the move to Texas seemed quite certain. The next day, I reached out to my youngest daughter and shared the news of my relocation. My wife also approached me the following day, expressing her intention to buy the house from me. She was willing to pay above the asking price in an attempt to make me happy. Truth be told, nothing she could do would make me happy at this point, but I wanted to get rid of the house, so I agreed to sell it to her. I didn't want to waste any more time here. She offered an apology, acknowledging that she's messed up and all the things I accused her of were true. She claimed not to know what led her to do those things and expressed her commitment to seek help.